Welcome to Travel Adventures. We're going to visit faraway places and travel back to long ago times. We'll visit 7 women from the Bible. Some you'll recognize, some you've never heard of. Were women not very important? Or were they equally important but written out by a patriarchal society? Let's find out. Our first guest is Eve. Eve was the first woman God created, and she has been called the most beautiful woman ever.
Well, in truth, there wasn't much competition in those days.
Yeah, it's true. I guess you're right. Now, Eve, as the first woman ever created, there can be no doubt as to your importance, I presume. Certainly everyone's heard of you. Everyone knows the story of how you and Adam lived in harmony with nature in the Garden of Eden. Yet you threw all that away by disobeying the one rule God had given you. You were both banished from Eden and made to live a hard life after that.
Yes, that's right. We were so happy, full of love and joy and beauty everywhere we looked. And then everything changed. We disobeyed God's law, and boy, was he mad. Well, hurt and disappointed, I suppose, rather than mad. I must tell you that for a very long time, both of us were saddened and humiliated by the whole incident. But then I suddenly realized that I had nothing to be ashamed of. Sorrowful, yes, but not ashamed. After all, I didn't purposely go to the forbidden fruit tree to snag one. The devil serpent lied to me to get me to eat it. He tricked me. It was so good that I took it to Adam so that he could taste the sweet juice also. Now Adam was the one to whom God spoke and said we were not to eat the fruit of that one tree. I told Adam where I got the piece in my hand. He should have turned my offer down. I wasn't there when God gave that command.
Eve, I must say it sounds like you're trying to throw Adam under the bus.
That may be true, but don't forget that Adam did the same thing.
Yes, I understand when God confronted the two of you, Adam was quick to say it was your idea. You gave it to him to eat. In fact, he even tried to blame God, didn't he? Because God gave you to him in the first place.
Yes, we knew then the full extent of our actions. Before that, we were filled with love and joy. But now that we disobeyed God, we seem to be eager to push the blame onto the other one. That was a real loss of paradise. Now Adam has to work hard in the field to provide for our family. And each time I get pregnant, the pain of bringing the child into the world is almost too much to bear sometimes.
But in spite of that, you consider that you were blessed by God because of all those offspring, I believe. And we read your story in every Bible that exists in every language.
Yes, that's true. God blessed us with many children, and I feel that my purpose was fulfilled by the children. I thank you for letting me set the record straight.
Well, thank you, Eve. We've really enjoyed our visit today. Our next visit will be to the tents of Sarah and her husband Abraham. Sarah loves her husband completely. She is devoted to him, and caring for him in every way is her life's job and joy. She has been described as bossy, shrewish, but he loves her too, to the depth of his being.
I know you've heard all sorts of stories about me. Did you picture me as a mean, old, somewhat domineering shrew? Go ahead, you can say the truth. But I bet I've surprised you too, haven't I? For one thing, most people who know me say I used to be quite pretty when I was younger. And I hope you'll notice as we dig a little deeper that I can be joyful and happy and, well, nice. My life centered around a dear man whom I adored, named Abraham. He was a special man who loved God and obeyed him without question. When God told Abraham that his seed would be that by which all the world would be blessed, I eagerly anticipated the day when I would bear him a son.
I understand Abraham was also eager to have a child.
Yes, of course, but year after year I bore no child. I grew more and more despondent. Finally, I convinced Abraham he must take my maidservant to his bed and let her bear him a son. I couldn't think of any other way to do God's will.
When you loved someone as much as you loved him, it must have been terribly hard to do that.
Yes, it nearly killed me. In fact, that was the biggest mistake of my life. First of all, it tore me apart when she gave birth to Abraham's son. I became so angry I blamed him. Secondly, perhaps my biggest mistake was losing my faith in God. If he said Abraham's seed would lead to the Savior of the world, then he would surely make that happen somehow without my interference. I knew then that I had to leave it in God's hands. But that too was very hard to do. 24 years later, in spite of our repeated attempts to make it happen, I was still childless. God knew we were losing hope, so he promised Abraham that in 1 year I would bear a son, and we were to name him Isaac. Then, miracle of miracles, it happened. When I was 89 years old and my husband was 100, both of us long past the age to bear children, I became pregnant and gave birth to a healthy son. My message to you and to everyone listening is to never lose hope. When God is going to make something happen, it will happen, but in his time frame, not yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Yours is a tale to remember. Ever hear of the walls of Jericho? I bet you have. Well, we're going there next, and we're going to try to visit with a woman who's been referred to as a harlot named Rahab. Rahab is a woman alone, and therefore makes her living in the only way open to her. But she does her job well, and it shows in the comforts she enjoys. That is, until one day when two men come to her door seeking entrance. She can tell they do not wish to be noticed, but that's okay, isn't it? It didn't scare you.
Not at all. In fact, it was quite the contrary. You see, it is what I'm used to. Most men who come here do not wish to be seen, but there was something obviously different about them. They treated me differently. They were respectful in talking to me. And as we talked, they told me about themselves and their way of life. And then the more I learned about them and the more I learned about their way of life, I was drawn to it and to them. They told me they were part of a large group led by a man named Joshua, and they were planning to take over our town of Jericho. These two men were scouting strategic locations, and what they described about their lives and about their God sounded so wonderful, and I soon knew I wanted to learn more and be part of just that.
That must have surprised you, since you'd only known them for a few days.
Yes, I guess it did, but I'm not sure I noticed it much until I discovered that the king was aware of their presence and asked me to bring them to him. And an inner sense just told me immediately that something was wrong. So, when the king's men came to get them, I purposely sent the guardsmen in the opposite direction so the men would have time to escape and report back to Joshua.
In other words, you lied to the king's men, and anyone who's read the Bible knows that God detests a lie, and yet we can't argue with the result. How to justify this? That's a dilemma.
No, it was not a dilemma for me. And yes, there are those who say I should have trusted God to see them safely away. But my faith is not weak as they claim. It was just too new to me. I was too vulnerable. Even when the fighting broke out between Joshua's army and the king's men, and when I saw the walls crumbling to let Joshua's army advance, I knew it was the hand of God that led me to make my decision. And to continue with my life story, in later years I married and gave birth to a son. we named him Boaz. Yes, this is the same Boaz who helped Ruth, fell in love with her, and saved her family from despair and death.
Rehab, yours is a story that I'm not sure would be believed if we hadn't heard it from your lips. Thank you so much. Well, our next stop will be in Israel, where we hope to catch up with Ruth, a woman of great responsibility and a strong faith in God. Isn't that true, Ruth?
You might say that I've had the lowest of lows and the highest of highs. You see, I was born a Moabite. We worshiped many gods, but our chief god was Chemosh. Since I was a child, I recall the fire and music and dancing and twirling while we worshiped him. I even recall a lovely young woman who gave her life so she could wed to Chemosh.
My word, you mean human sacrifice?
Yes, we were taught that it would please Chemosh, but life was very difficult. We had no rain and the grain died in the fields. The goats died because we had no grain with which to feed them. Friends and family were dying from lack of food and water. And then we realized that Israel must be even worse off than we were. We learned that from Elimelech and his family. The arrival in Moab caused quite a commotion. The people of Israel worship a different God, and they really dislike Moabites because we have Chemosh. So to see them come to Moab in spite of this, we knew things there must be dire indeed.
From your description, life must have been dark and dreary indeed.
Yes, but there was a bright spot when I met Mahlon. He was one of the sons of Elimelech and Naomi. They had 2 sons who were very kind and loving. Mahlon and I fell in love and were married. Normally, Israelites were not permitted to marry Moabites, but Naomi, their mother, knew it was best. By this time, Elimelech had died. Then to my horror, Mahlon died, as did his brother Chilion. Now we were alone. Naomi, Orpah, who's Chilion's widow, and me. We had no way to earn money or have a home. Naomi decided to return to her people in Israel and take us with her. We agreed at first, then Orpah wished to stay in Moab. Those were her people, and she turned back. But although I was a Moabite, I chose to stay with Naomi.
But how did you survive without help from a man? I know that sounds ridiculous, but in those days that was a hard fact of life.
Yes, you're quite right. Women alone had very little chance for survival. But I knew Naomi's faith was strong, and that made me trust her and her God. When we arrived in Israel, I began to work in the fields, gleaning whatever grain I could collect from the staff. The owner of the fields, a man named Boaz, seemed to like me, and eventually he got the courage to tell me that. We were married shortly after with Naomi's encouragement. Although I started out poor and hungry, I ended with a wonderful husband and life partner in a beautiful new land.
Ruth, you have been through so much, and yet you can still look back on your life and consider yourself blessed. You are a tough lady. Now we come upon a very different woman. Delilah is usually regarded as the whore who seduced dear Samson and tricked him into divulging the secret of his strength. Well, when we meet her, Delilah might tell the story a little differently. Good afternoon, Delilah.
Good afternoon, and welcome to my home. Won't you sit down?
Delilah, as I told you, the general consensus is that you are an evil woman who tricked a poor defenseless man into revealing his greatest weakness. But I understand that's not quite right.
Absolutely, there's a lot wrong with that. For starters, Samson was not a poor defenseless man. He was born special. An angel of God announced his birth, and that's only happened to Isaac, John the Baptist, and Jesus. So you see, he was in an exclusive group.
I had no idea.
No, most folks don't. For some reason, that part is left out of the story. Also, Samson was a Nazirite, a man set aside from the others so he could perform special services to God. There were limitations on his life, though, such as he could drink no wine, nor touch a dead body, or cut his hair. But Samson ignored his Nazirite vow of godly devotion and relied upon his own strength and abilities rather than upon God's. Although God empowered him with supernatural strength to begin the deliverance of the people of Israel from the Philistines, it was his weakness for the Philistine women that did him in. His passion for women was more important to him than God's expressed will. During his wedding to a Philistine woman, Samson was deceived and humiliated by his wife and wedding guests. Angered, Samson got his revenge by personally killing 1,000 men. In the end, it was his passionate obsession for me that led him to reveal the secret of his strength. I cut his hair, and as a result, he was captured, blinded, and forced to grind grain for his enemies. Eventually, while in prison, Samson's strength did return, and he died while destroying the temple of the Philistine god Dagon, killing thousands of Philistines. He not only failed to deliver his people, but killed himself. He was courageous before men, but weak when it came to women.
What a different story you tell, Delilah. Thank you for sharing that with us today.
My pleasure.
Can you even imagine the strength it must have taken to destroy something that size? Our journey has taken us to deserts and tents of a nomadic people, and to the riches of the dark underside of town. Now it takes us to another totally different environment, a temple. In that temple we find Anna, an old woman with very little in the way of material goods, but with a look of love and contentment in her face that many would envy. Her modesty prevents her from acknowledging that she's any different, though, doesn't it, Anna?
Oh, you're such a kidder. But you're right about me being content. Don't forget that I have had my prayers answered, and you can't ask for more than that.
That's right, you have, although I believe it took many, many years for that to happen.
Oh my, yes, a very long time. You see, my husband died just a few years after we were wed, so we had no time to start a family. As I'm sure you've learned in talking to the others, a woman alone doesn't have much chance for survival. But I was lucky. I had a small inheritance from my family, and by being very careful and frugal, I managed to live by myself for several years, and finally moved into the temple at the priest's approval. I prayed there every day, every hour. In fact, I never left it, and I only prayed for one thing, over and over and over. I even fasted when I prayed.
Fasted? But why? Surely you knew that wasn't going to get you what you wanted.
No, but fasting cleared my mind so I could focus on my prayers.
Well, can you share with us what you were praying for all those years?
Of course. I knew God was sending a Messiah. He promised that. I prayed for that for over 60 years. But I knew he was coming. I knew it. Then one day I was walking around in the temple. A crowd had gathered, and I saw Simeon addressing them. As I edged closer, I heard him speak the words I wanted to hear. A baby, the Son of God, has been born. My prayers were answered, as I knew they would be.
Yes, indeed, Anna. While most folks pray for something and expect FedEx to bring it tomorrow, you waited over 60 years. But in all that time, you believed, didn't you?
Of course. I'm glad I had a chance to tell you about it.
And so are we, Anna. Thank you so much. Now we're on our way to visit with a woman whose reputation has run the gamut, from a woman of the streets to the bride of Jesus Christ. As for me, I don't believe either of those, but we're here to let you form your own opinions. So let's go visit with Mary Magdalene. Good morning, Mary.
And good morning to you. I am glad to hear that you don't believe either extreme story about me. That's good. It means there's hope that other folks will follow suit. I would be amused if it weren't happening to me, I suppose. I've heard people say that I washed the feet of Jesus and wiped them with my hair. I've heard that I was caught committing adultery and would have been stoned to death if Jesus had not rescued me. Then, of course, there's the theory that Jesus and I were wed and had children. And in every single story, there are absolutely no facts to substantiate it. And yet they continue to this day.
So if you are none of those things, what is your story and how did you come to meet Jesus?
My beginnings were dark and evil. I am from the village of Magdala. That's why people call me Mary Magdalene. There are so many Marys in the Bible that someone had to find a way to differentiate one from another. Magdala is very near where Peter grew up.
Oh, so it's near the Sea of Galilee then.
Yes, that's right. Well, many people in that area are possessed by demons, and I was one of them. Then Jesus came to save me and drew out the demons from me. The change in my life was indescribable. I vowed then and there that I would follow him for the rest of my life, and I did. There were several of us that traveled with him, and we cooked and did what we could do, so the men could do what they had to do to help tell the others about our Savior. I was with my Lord when he was crucified, and I wept at his feet. I loved him so much. And then again, when we went to the tomb and found it empty, I wept bitterly.
I remember reading that you and the others were terrified that he'd been stolen.
Yes, we were. The men and the other women ran off in different directions, partly from fear and partly to see what they could find out. But I stayed behind and wept. Then I looked up to see someone standing before me. At first I thought he was the gardener. Who else would be at the tombs this early in the morning? But when he spoke,
Mary, do you not recognize me?
I knew it was Jesus, and my heart leapt with joy.
Go and tell the others what you have witnessed.
Much later on, I found out that I was the first one to see my Lord after he rose from the dead. The very first one. I ran to tell the others as he instructed me to do. He lives! He lives! I shouted it with such joy.
Thank you, Mary. I hope this will silence those false stories about you once and for all. Women, were they important to God? We've just presented 7 of them to you and asked them to tell you their stories. If you believe them, you can't draw any conclusion other than yes, they were important to God. In case you're still sitting on the fence, however, here's one more story. In Romans 16, verse 7, Paul talks about a female apostle named Junia. He called her outstanding among the apostles. But later translations refer to her as a man, or change her name to Junias, the male form of Junia. We can give you many other examples if you like. You'll find them on the table by the door, so please help yourself. As for the examples we've given you today, we just scratched the surface on each one. We'd like to suggest you read more about them to really understand the lives they led and the sacrifices they made. But what we've given you so far should at least tickle your gray matter about the subject. And it's important, now, today. For instance, the Catholic Church doesn't allow women to become priests. Why? Because they claim Jesus only had male apostles. And we've seen that's incorrect. On the contrary, women in the society of the day had a lesser position than the men, yes. They were little more than property. And yet they're referred to reverently many times in the Bible. That must show you how much Jesus regarded women. Thank you for watching with us. But before you go, I'd like to introduce the folks who worked so hard on this project. Lynn and Sue offered to help with costumes, so we hounded the second-hand stores and our own linen closets, as well as the members of our church, to get enough material to make 13 costumes. Looks like we're tailgating at some event, doesn't it? Nope, we're setting up the tent scenes for Sarah's presentation. All in a day's work. Here's a group shot showing everybody who contributed, but even at that, there's a couple of people missing. And of course, our dedicated cast and crew. Gail and Stan Dunn, who played Adam and Eve. Joe Geek was Abraham. Sally Geek was his wife, Sarah. Joanne Rawls played Rahab. Tom Parker was soldier number 1. John Down was soldier number 2, and then later played the part of Samson. Martha Down was Ruth. Sue Massey was Delilah. Lynn Sprouse, the lady in charge of Bad Girls, was Anna. Pat Peirce was Mary Magdalene. And Carl Rust was Jesus. And we want to specially thank Frank McAfee, who volunteered to be our photographer but refused to have his picture taken. And finally, thank you to this great group of folks for helping make my dream a reality.